You know how some stories just never let go of us. This is one of them. It's about a man who was too ambitious for the world he was born into, and too powerful for the world he tried to build. A man worshipped by the people and stabbed to death by his peers. A man whose life began with political exile and ended with divine status. This is the story of Julius Caesar, not the statue, not the myth, but the human being behind the crown, behind the chaos. His rise, his betrayal, his murder, and the empire that rose from his blood. I'm glad you're here, because once you hear it all, you may not see power or history the same way again. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Myth. I was scrolling through the usual internet rabbit holes again the other night. You know, the ones that start with a simple search like most scandalous murders in history. And before you know it, you're 3 Wikipedia articles deep watching a grainy YouTube video about someone who may or may not have poisoned their entire wedding party in 1814. Just me? Probably not. Anyway, that's how I stumbled once again on the murder of Julius Caesar. Now I know what you're thinking. Julius Caesar isn't that just some ancient Roman guy who got stabbed a bunch of times. That story always felt distant to me, dusty wrapped in toga myths, more like a scene from a play than something that actually happened. I mean, the only Caesars I really knew were the ones on a pizza box or in a salad bowl. But this time, I looked a little closer. I clicked a few links, read past the headline. And suddenly it wasn't just about a powerful man being betrayed by his friends. It was about obsession, ego, revenge. It was about a man who rose so far so fast that the entire world seemed to tremble beneath his feet, and how that kind of power never comes without consequences. See, when we think of Julius Caesar, we think of grand speeches, war victories, maybe that one Shakespeare line everyone knows, et tu brute, but there's so much more beneath the surface. The real story, it's messier, it's human. And honestly, it's a lot darker than I expected. Because Caesar wasn't just a general or a politician, he was complicated, ruthless, yes, but also wildly charming, brilliant and manipulative, vain and strategic. A man who seemed to collect both enemies and lovers with the same relentless passion. There were scandals, affairs, rumors that followed him through the Senate and into the bedrooms of kings and queens. People either worshipped him or wanted him dead. There wasn't much in between. And that got me thinking, how does someone become so powerful that the only way to stop them is murder? That's what I wanted to find out. Not the sanitized version, not the glorified Caesar carved into marble. I wanted the raw version, the version full of contradictions of pride and pain, of bloody choices and public humiliation. The kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about history and about how power really works. So that's what we're doing today. We're diving into the true scandalous and violent history of Julius Caesar, the boy who lost his father young, who grew up in a political machine he would later break apart, who rose through charm and cunning, and who in the end was betrayed by the very people who once praised his name. This isn't a lesson, this is a warning, a profile, a story that echoes through time in the worst and most fascinating way possible. And by the time we're done, you might just find yourself asking the same question I did. Did Julius Caesar really deserve to die? Let's start at the beginning. Chapter 2. Bloodlines, Burdens, and the Bride. He couldn't leave. Let's rewind a bit back to where it all started. Before the betrayal, before the politics, before the murder, Julius Caesar was born in the year 100 BC in a time when the Roman Republic was already simmering with corruption, class wars, and power plays. He wasn't born a god. He wasn't even born special, at least not in the way legends make it sound. But he was born into privilege. His family, the Julii, claimed noble roots, stretching all the way back to Venus, the Roman goddess of love and beauty. Whether that's mythology or marketing, I'll let you decide. But in Rome, lineage was everything. And Caesar's family had just enough status to matter and just enough ambition to want more. His father, Gaius Julius Caesar, was a moderately successful politician. Not quite elite, but connected enough to get in the right rooms. And Caesar's mother, Aurelia, was known for being smart, shrewd, and quietly influential. She was the type of Roman woman who didn't need to speak loudly to be respected, and in many ways, she shaped the man Caesar would become more than anyone else. But everything changed when Caesar was 15. His father died suddenly. Some say it was natural causes, others think it might have been stress or illness. Either way, young Caesar was thrust into a role he wasn't ready for. He became the head of his household overnight. And in ancient Rome, that wasn't just symbolic. It meant real power, real responsibility. He had to manage finances, represent his family name, and most importantly, position himself for the future. For a lot of teenagers, that might have crushed them, but Caesar. He stepped into it with this strange confidence, like he'd been waiting for the moment life would finally force his hand. And that's when the marriage proposal came. It wasn't romantic, not even close. In Rome, marriage wasn't about love, it was about alliances, strategic partnerships. Who you married could make or break your career. So when Caesar was told he'd be marrying Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, one of the most powerful men in Rome, it wasn't really a question. Cinna was a populist leader, a man at odds with the conservative elites. Aligning with him meant choosing a side in a brewing civil war. But Caesar agreed, maybe because he saw the opportunity, or maybe because at 15 he didn't have much of a choice. Cornelia was young, beautiful, and more importantly, political royalty. Their marriage positioned Caesar as a rising star in Cinna's faction. And as a wedding gift of sorts, Cinna nominated him to become a Flamen Dialis, a high-ranking priest of Jupiter. Now that might sound impressive, but here's the catch: the job came with a ton of restrictions. As a Flamen, Caesar wasn't allowed to touch a horse. He couldn't look at or be near a dead body. He couldn't spend more than 3 nights outside the city. He couldn't even cut his own hair or wear regular clothes. He had to don ceremonial robes, weird pointy hats, and follow rituals that made him seem more like a prop than a person. For a teenage boy with a thirst for adventure, glory, and battle, it was a nightmare. This was a time when Rome was a brutal, chaotic place. Civil unrest, military uprisings, political assassinations. The Republic was teetering, and young men with ambition wanted to be in the center of the storm, not stuck in temples praying to statues. But Caesar was trapped, bound by duty. His marriage, his title, his family, they all tethered him to a life he didn't want, and yet he played the part, for a while, until everything fell apart. Cinna, the man who had orchestrated this whole rise, was suddenly killed during a political rebellion. And with him gone, a new power rose to fill the vacuum. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a ruthless general with no patience for anyone associated with his enemies. And Caesar, he was married to Cinna's daughter. So now that marriage that had once been his golden ticket became a death sentence. Sulla began purging the Republic of anyone tied to Cinna. Executions, confiscations, exiles. He ruled with an iron fist and no one was safe. Then Sulla gave Caesar an ultimatum: divorce Cornelia or die. This is the part that still surprises me. Caesar refused. 18 years old, politically exposed, financially vulnerable, living in a city gripped by terror. And he said no. He said no to the most powerful man in Rome. That single act of defiance nearly cost him everything. Sulla seized Caesar's inheritance, stripped him of his priesthood, and put his name on the proscription list, basically a public hit list. Anyone could kill him without consequence. So Caesar went into hiding. He disappeared from the city he loved. He lost his home, his fortune, and the safety of his title. But he never lost his ambition. And in exile, something hardened in him. That teenager who had once felt suffocated by ritual and rules, he was gone. What returned years later was something else entirely. Not just a man, but a survivor. Someone who knew now exactly what it would take to claw his way back, and who he'd have to step over to do it. That moment when Caesar chose loyalty over self-preservation, it set the tone for everything that followed. He would become many things: a general, a seducer, a tyrant, a symbol. But above all, Julius Caesar would become a man who refused to bow to anyone, and that choice would haunt the Republic for years to come. Next, we'll see what happened when Caesar came back to Rome and started turning heads not just for his politics, but for his fashion. his affairs, and the rumors that made him infamous. Because power, it starts with presence. And Caesar made sure no one could ignore him. Chapter 3. The comeback nobody saw coming. By the time Julius Caesar returned to Rome, he wasn't the same boy who had once been forced into a priesthood he didn't want. He wasn't the scared teenager hiding from Sulla's death squads. He was still young, yes, barely in his 20s, but something in him had changed. He had tasted fear, and survived it. Now he came back not to blend in, but to stand out, and trust me, he did. Rome itself had changed too. After Sulla's bloody reign, the Republic was exhausted, power had been redistributed, old enemies were dead or exiled, and the Senate was littered with people who owed Sulla everything. But Sulla was gone now. And in that fragile space between chaos and order, Caesar saw opportunity. He didn't have wealth, he didn't have an army, not yet. But what he did have was presence and style. That's what people first noticed. Caesar wasn't like the other men in politics. Most Roman politicians dressed modestly, short tunics, plain togas, always aiming for some ideal of masculine humility. But Caesar. He wore custom-made robes with long sleeves and delicate embroidery. He tied his waist with a fashionable belt, something no one else was doing. He paid attention to how he looked. Some called it vanity, some called it weakness, but everyone noticed. They even gave him a nickname, the Dandy. And if you think that sounds like a compliment, it wasn't. It was meant to mock him. A dandy was a man who cared too much about clothes, appearance, perfume. A man who wasn't quite manly enough in the eyes of the old-school Roman elite. But Caesar didn't care. If anything, he leaned into it. There were even rumors that he was balding, which in ancient Rome was seen as a sign of disfigurement. Caesar combed over the front of his hair to hide the spot, and legend says he hated when anyone brought it up. But instead of disappearing from the public eye, he stepped further into it. Because Caesar understood something most others didn't in a city ruled by spectacle image, was power. And while the Senate whispered about his robes and his hairline, the people Rome's everyday citizens watched him with fascination. But fashion wasn't the only thing setting Caesar apart. There were rumors. Whispers that he had spent a little too much time with King Nicomedes of Bithynia during a diplomatic mission, that he hadn't just secured a military alliance, but maybe something a bit more personal. They said Caesar had stayed in the king's private quarters, that he'd been seen in the royal bedroom, often. Now, in modern times, this might not seem like a big deal, but in ancient Rome, where masculinity was tightly policed and public image was everything, these rumors were dangerous. It wasn't about being gay. Same-sex relationships weren't uncommon in Rome. What mattered was who you were in that relationship, the dominant one or the submissive one. And the rumors were clear Caesar had been the submissive, the bottom, the boy toy of a foreign king. To the Roman elite, that wasn't just gossip. That was an attack on his authority, on his manhood, on his right to lead. One of his political enemies, a man named Curio, even said publicly that Caesar was every woman's man and every man's woman. The Senate laughed. The streets echoed with jokes. But Caesar. He didn't flinch. He denied it all, of course, publicly, vehemently. But he didn't let it derail his path. If anything, the rumors seemed to make him work harder, louder, bolder. He began studying public speaking rhetoric and quickly became known for his sharp tongue and emotional delivery. He wasn't the most experienced, but people listened. When Caesar spoke, crowds formed. That charisma, the same thing that got him into the king's court, was now turning him into a rising political star. And then, in a twist straight out of a pirate movie, Caesar was kidnapped. Yes, really. He was sailing across the Aegean Sea, heading to study rhetoric in Rhodes, when a group of pirates captured him. Pirates. Real ones. They didn't know who he was, just figured he looked rich enough for a ransom. So they demanded 20 talents of silver for his release. But instead of panicking, Caesar laughed in their faces. He told them the ransom was too low, that he was worth at least 50. They were confused. He was serious. And while he waited for the money to arrive, Caesar took over their ship. He gave orders, told them when to sleep, when to eat. He even forced them to sit through his poetry readings and warned them that if they didn't like his verses, he'd have them killed. They thought he was joking. They were wrong. Because once the ransom was paid and Caesar was released, he gathered a small navy, tracked down the pirates, and had them crucified, just like he said he would. That story, it spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Caesar wasn't just a well-dressed loudmouth with a questionable reputation. He was bold, unpredictable, and dangerous. He had made his mark not through war, not yet, but through survival, reinvention, and revenge. And people started paying attention for real. He wasn't a general, he wasn't even a senator yet, but Julius Caesar was becoming someone. Someone Rome couldn't ignore. Someone who was just getting started. Next, we'll see how Caesar turned charm into power and power into obsession when he steps fully into the world of politics, scandal, and strategy. Because for Julius Caesar, nothing was ever enough. And the real war hadn't even started yet. Chapter 4: Scandal, Seduction, and the Politics of Reputation. By now, Julius Caesar was no longer just the flashy outsider with a comb-over and good robes. He had made a name for himself not through war, not through wealth, but by surviving, by being unapologetically visible, and by knowing exactly how to get under Rome's skin. And then he started to rise. It began quietly. Caesar became an advocate, basically a lawyer, though in ancient Rome it was more about how well you could perform in front of a crowd than your actual legal knowledge. Trials weren't just about justice. They were public theater, political auditions. Caesar's first case he lost. But people remembered how he spoke, the emotion in his voice, the way he turned a courtroom into a stage. He may have lost the battle, but the crowd left with his name in their mouths. And in Rome, that was a win. Soon more cases followed, more attention, more allies. But Caesar wasn't satisfied. He wasn't just playing for the audience, he was playing for history. And he knew one thing in Rome: power came through perception. So if the Senate wanted to gossip, if the crowds wanted spectacle, then Caesar would give it to them. And that's where the real scandals began. Let's talk about sex and politics, because in Caesar's life, the two were almost indistinguishable. He had a reputation, and not a subtle one, for sleeping with the wives of senators, generals, even his political enemies. Some people thought it was pure lust. Others thought it was strategic, a way to gather secrets, form quiet alliances, or simply humiliate the men who tried to stand in his way. Whatever the reason, it worked. And at the center of this swirling mess of affairs and whispers was one woman, Servilia. Servilia wasn't just anyone. She was high-born, beautiful, fiercely intelligent, and married. But that didn't stop her from falling into an affair with Caesar that would last for years. And here's where it gets even messier. Servilia's half-brother was a man named Cato, also known as Cato the Younger. If Caesar was ambition, chaos, and flair, Cato was discipline, tradition, and restraint. The two men despised each other, politically, personally, philosophically, so when Caesar started sleeping with Cato's sister, that wasn't just scandal, that was war. Rome knew, the Senate knew, Cato knew, but no one said it out loud. Until one day during a Senate session, Cato tried to destroy Caesar publicly. It was supposed to be a power move. Caesar had just received a note, something discreet, passed hand to hand, and Cato, ever the purist, pounced. He demanded Caesar read it aloud to the entire Senate. Cato thought it was evidence of treason, some secret plot, maybe proof of Caesar's growing control over the military, anything to discredit him. But when Caesar smiled and handed the note to Cato, the room fell into a hush. And when Cato read it, it was a love letter. From Servilia. Detailed, explicit, steamy. The kind of thing that never should have been said out loud in a room full of senators. Cato turned red. He crumpled the note. The chamber erupted in laughter. And Caesar, he just sat there, smiling. Because that's the thing about Caesar, he knew how to weaponize humiliation. He made it part of his myth. You could mock his clothes, his hair, his rumors, but he always managed to flip it back on you. And now even the people trying to destroy him were just adding fuel to his fire. But there's a darker side to all this. Because while Caesar's reputation as a womanizer grew, so did his need to prove himself. The rumors about Nicomedes. They hadn't gone away. The jokes about being every man's woman still echoed in the Senate halls. And in Roman culture obsessed with masculine dominance, those whispers mattered. So Caesar doubled down, not just with women, but with power, with control. And that's when things started to escalate. He ran for higher office and won. Then he ran again, and won, and again. With each step he gathered more influence, more loyalty, more danger. At this point, Caesar wasn't just sleeping with people's wives. He was taking over their careers, their reputations, their futures. And some people were terrified of what he might do next. One of them was a man named Marcus Bibulus, Caesar's co-consul during one of his key political terms. Now, normally, a consul ruled alongside another. It was meant to be a balance. But Caesar, he didn't share power. Bibulus tried to oppose him, tried to block his laws, his decisions, his rise. So Caesar did something juvenile, but brilliant. He had a bucket of human waste, yes, poop, dumped on Bibulus in the middle of a Senate gathering, in front of everyone. A man who had spent his life chasing honor and tradition was publicly humiliated, reduced to a joke. And there was nothing he could do about it. Because Caesar controlled the crowd now, he was the star of the Republic. And even as his enemies whispered, plotted, and fumed, they couldn't touch him. Not yet. But the seeds had been planted, because the more Caesar climbed, the more reckless he became, not just with his body or his reputation, but with Rome itself. He wasn't just rewriting the rules, he was setting fire to them. Every affair, every speech, every insult, it was building toward something, a breaking point. And it was coming faster than anyone expected. In the next chapter, we'll follow Caesar onto the battlefield, where he finally gets what he's always wanted a war to call his own. But even then, even covered in blood and glory, he couldn't leave behind the scandals. Because for Caesar, war and sex and politics were never separate. They were all part of the same game. And he intended to win. Chapter 5. War, Wealth, and the Reinvention of Julius Caesar. By now, Caesar had built his reputation on charm, spectacle, and a relentless ability to stay standing no matter what Rome threw at him. Affairs survived them. Public humiliation turned it into applause. Political enemies buried them in wit and, occasionally, in actual poop. But for all his cleverness, Caesar knew there was still one thing he hadn't earned. Something that no amount of fast talking or fashionable robes could give him: glory. In Rome, real glory didn't come from speeches. It came from war. It came from blood. And Caesar had been waiting his whole life for that. He finally got the opportunity when he was appointed governor of Gaul, a vast tribal region that today covers parts of France, Belgium, and Switzerland. It was seen as a tough post, remote, unstable, not exactly desirable. But Caesar didn't see it as a punishment. He saw it as a blank canvas, an open battlefield, a place where he could rewrite who he was. Because here's the thing most people forget. Caesar wasn't just ambitious. He was in debt, deep debt. All the parties, the campaigns, the bribes, they added up. And Rome didn't pay its governors well. But what Rome did allow its governors to do was steal. And that's exactly what Caesar did. He launched a series of brutal campaigns known as the Gallic Wars. On paper, they were about protecting Rome's borders, defending the Republic, securing the future. But in reality, these wars were about two things: money and legacy. Caesar's troops burned villages, massacred tribes, enslaved entire populations. They pillaged gold, weapons, livestock, whatever they could carry. Every town they conquered helped Caesar pay down his debt. Every life taken pushed him further into legend. And Rome loved it. Because Caesar didn't just fight battles, he narrated them. He wrote detailed reports about each victory, each maneuver, each glorious moment, and had them sent back to Rome to be read aloud in the public square. He didn't wait for historians to write his story. He wrote it himself. It was propaganda in real time. And the people ate it up. They saw Caesar as this unstoppable hero, Rome's shining sword in the north. They didn't see the brutality, the blood, the villages burned to ash. They only saw what Caesar wanted them to see. And that's what made him so dangerous. Because as Caesar won battle after battle, his ego and his following grew. His army wasn't just loyal, they were devoted. These were men who had marched beside him for years, who had spilled blood under his command, who had become rich from his victories. Their loyalty wasn't to Rome, it was to him, and that terrified the Senate. Back in Rome, Caesar's enemies were watching all this unfold with increasing dread, especially Pompey, a former ally turned bitter rival. Pompey had once been the golden boy of the Republic, a general, a statesman, a man loved by the people. But now Caesar's star was rising fast, too fast. The two men clashed politically, then publicly. And before long, Rome was teetering on the edge of civil war. The Senate demanded Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. And Caesar, he refused. He knew what that meant. If he returned without his army, they'd destroy him. Legally, politically, maybe even physically. And Caesar wasn't going to let that happen. So instead, he made a decision. He crossed a small river called the Rubicon. Now today that name doesn't sound like much. But back then it was a hard border. No general was allowed to bring troops across it into Italy. Doing so was considered an act of treason. It was declaring war on Rome itself. And Caesar did it anyway. He crossed the Rubicon with a single legion and uttered the words that would echo through history, Alea iacta est. The die is cast. It wasn't just a military move, it was a message. I won't be controlled, I won't be stopped, and I will burn this entire system down before I ever bow to it. What followed was chaos. Pompey fled Rome, gathering support from the Senate's loyalists. Caesar marched south, seizing cities, consolidating power. The Republic was unraveling, and Caesar, the once scandalous robe-wearing, bottom-rumored boy, was now the most feared man in the empire. And here's what really strikes me. So much of this wasn't just about politics or strategy, it was personal. Caesar had been mocked, undermined, ridiculed, for his style, for his sexuality, for his boldness, and now he was proving through violence, through dominance, that no one would laugh again. The war between Caesar and Pompey came to a head at a place called Pharsalus. Outnumbered, outarmed, and outresourced, Caesar's forces should have lost. But they didn't. They won, brutally. Pompey fled again, this time to Egypt, hoping to regroup. But Caesar wasn't far behind. And when he arrived in Alexandria, he was handed a box containing Pompey's head. A trophy. A final insult. And in a rare moment of vulnerability, Caesar reportedly wept. Not because he mourned Pompey, but because it was over. The chase, the rivalry, the only man who had ever truly matched him, was gone. And Caesar was now alone at the top. The Senate was broken, the Republic in ruins. The man they'd once mocked had become a living god in the eyes of the people. He had the army, the wealth, the myth. But here's the thing about standing at the top, there's only one way left to fall. And somewhere in the shadows of Rome, the knives were already being sharpened. In the next chapter, we'll watch Caesar return home hailed as a savior, but already marked as a tyrant. Because power like his doesn't just threaten rivals, it threatens everything. And eventually, someone always pushes back. Chapter 6. The God Who Walked into the Senate. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome after defeating Pompey, he wasn't just a general coming home from war. He was something bigger, something untouchable. He entered the city not as a man, but as a myth. The kind of figure people whispered about in markets, sculpted into marble, painted onto walls. To many Romans, Caesar was the savior. The man who had crushed their enemies, brought stability, and shown that the Senate, bloated and corrupt, wasn't as powerful as it claimed to be. To others, though, he was a warning. A man who had defied every rule of the Republic. Who had used war wealth and spectacle to crown himself in everything but name. And that terrified them. Because Caesar wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't maneuvering from the sidelines. He was taking up space, massive, unapologetic space. He returned to Rome with the full force of a celebrity-turned-dictator. He threw games, festivals, banquets. He canceled debts, passed reforms, gave land to his soldiers, gave grain to the poor. To the common people he was generous, gracious, even divine. But to the Senate he was a monster they had created and now couldn't control. Still, they couldn't move against him. Not yet. Not when the streets were chanting his name. not when he could summon an army with a single wave of his hand. So instead they smiled, they clapped, they gave him new titles. And Caesar kept pushing. He had statues built in his honor, declared holidays in his name, even had a temple constructed where he would be worshipped alongside the gods. Let me say that again. He made himself a god. And if you're thinking that sounds like a bad idea, yeah, a lot of people thought so too, especially the senators. These were men who had grown up believing in shared power, in balance, in checks and procedures. And now all of that was being burned down in front of them. But Caesar didn't care. He was euphoric. You could feel it in the way he spoke, in the way he walked through the Senate chambers like they were his palace, in how he dressed robes that shimmered with purple, a color once reserved for kings. And remember, kings were a dirty word in Rome. The entire republic had been built to avoid monarchy. They hated the idea of one man ruling everything. That's why Caesar's behavior, even if it wasn't officially a crown, felt so threatening. And then he did something no one expected. He asked to be named dictator for life. Now let that sink in. Not temporary power, not wartime leadership, for life. The Senate granted it. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe because they believed they didn't have a choice. And that was the moment it became clear the Republic was dead. At least, that's how it felt. And yet, Caesar wasn't done. He started planning new military campaigns, new expansions. He talked about invading Parthia, Arabia, even Britain again. But behind the scenes, more and more senators were having very different conversations. Whispers, glances, small, quiet meetings in dim corners of palaces. Because here's the thing about power. When you hoard all of it, you also paint a target on your back. One of those whispers came from a man named Brutus. Now, if you've heard the phrase, et tu, Brute, this is that Brutus. And he wasn't just a random senator. He was close to Caesar. Some say Caesar loved him like a son. Others say they were even romantically involved, though like most things in Caesar's life, that's buried in rumor and ego and smoke. What matters is that Brutus was once loyal. But loyalty has limits, because Brutus, like many others, saw what was happening and started to feel sick about it. This wasn't leadership anymore. This was domination, a cult, a slow erasure of everything Rome once stood for. And so the knives came out. 60 senators. That's how many joined the plot. They didn't all agree on the details. Some were motivated by principle, others by jealousy. But they all agreed on one thing: Julius Caesar had to die. Still, Caesar didn't see it coming. And honestly, I get it. He had been threatened before, mocked, lied about, hunted, and every single time he came out on top. Why would this be any different? Even when a soothsayer, basically an ancient Roman fortune teller, warned him, "Beware the Ides of March," he brushed it off. Just another dramatic Roman, probably. But March 15th came anyway. And on that day, Caesar arrived at the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was scheduled to meet. He came alone, without his bodyguards. Surrounded by men he thought he knew. Men he had promoted, helped, embraced. They greeted him warmly. They smiled. They circled him. And then one of them pulled his toga. That was the signal. And suddenly it began. Blade after blade. Thrust after thrust. They stabbed him in the back, the chest, the face. His blood spilled onto the marble floor of the Senate, pooling around the statue of Pompey, the rival he had defeated years before. Poetic, cruel. Some say he fought back. Others say he stood frozen in shock. But what almost everyone agrees on is that when he saw Brutus, something broke inside him. Not just his body, but his soul. The betrayal wasn't the knife. It was the face holding it. And then it was over. Julius Caesar, the man who wanted to be a god, lay dead at the feet of a statue. The senators had done it. The Republic, in their eyes, had been saved. But they were wrong. Because Caesar's death didn't bring peace. It brought chaos, riots, civil war, blood on the streets. And in the power vacuum he left behind, new monsters emerged even more ambitious than he was, including one named Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. but that's for another time. What matters now is this: Caesar got everything he ever wanted: power, legacy, immortality. But the cost. It was trust, it was friendship, it was his life. And as his blood dried on the Senate floor, the people of Rome were left to wonder, did Caesar rise too far, or did everyone else simply fail to rise with him? Chapter 7. The blood didn't wash away. I still can't get that image out of my head. Caesar lying there on the marble floor, bleeding out at the base of Pompey's statue. The irony of that moment, it feels almost scripted, like the gods themselves wrote it. But this wasn't a myth. This was real. And when the knives were pulled back and the Senate floor fell silent, the men who had done it, these senators, these self-proclaimed guardians of the Republic, looked at each other almost stunned, like they hadn't fully believed it would work, or maybe they hadn't fully thought through what would come next. Because here's the truth they didn't want to face: killing Caesar didn't kill Caesar's legacy. If anything, it made it stronger. Word of his death spread through Rome like wildfire. At first there was confusion, then anger, then something even worse, grief. Not from the elites, not from the senators or aristocrats, but from the people. Because while the conspirators saw Caesar as a tyrant, the public saw him as a hero. The man who gave them land food games. The man who broke the old rules and made them feel like they mattered. To them, Caesar wasn't just a politician. He was theirs. And now, he was gone. When his body was laid out in the forum for the funeral, the atmosphere shifted. This wasn't just a formal ceremony, it was a moment of reckoning. Mark Antony Caesar's closest ally and right-hand man gave the funeral speech. And let me tell you, it wasn't subtle. He held up Caesar's bloodied toga. He pointed to each stab wound. He named the traitors one by one, not explicitly, but just enough for the crowd to feel the betrayal. And then he read Caesar's will. It left money, actual money, to every Roman citizen. It promised land to the soldiers. It showed in writing that Caesar had been thinking about the people long after the Senate stopped pretending to care. That was the spark. The crowd turned violent, furious. People rioted in the streets. They burned the Senate building. Some tried to storm the homes of the conspirators. Others just screamed his name until their voices broke. This wasn't justice. This was martyrdom. And for the senators who thought they were saving the Republic, it must have felt like the ground was falling out beneath them, because suddenly they weren't seen as protectors. They were seen as murderers, cowards, hypocrites. They had killed a man to save Rome, but instead they set Rome on fire. And in that smoke, someone new was rising. His name was Octavian, though you might know him better as Augustus. He was Caesar's adopted son, barely 20 years old, but already you could see the gears turning behind his eyes. He wasn't loud like Antony. He didn't rage in the streets. He moved quietly, strategically. But what he understood maybe better than anyone else was that Caesar's death wasn't the end of a legacy. It was the beginning of a myth. Octavian knew he could use that, the name, the tragedy, the story. He aligned himself with Antony, for a while, anyway. They hunted down the conspirators. Brutus Cassius and the rest chased them across the empire, cornered them in battles they couldn't win. Most died by suicide. Rome watched them fall. And just like that, the men who had tried to save the Republic were erased from it. Their names became footnotes. Meanwhile, Octavian returned to Rome not as Caesar's heir, but as his second coming. He declared Caesar a god, built temples, minted coins with Caesar's face, even called himself the son of the divine. And the people, they bought it. They wanted to believe. After so much chaos, after so much blood, they didn't want another republic. They wanted order, stability, legacy. And that's what Octavian gave them. Eventually, he would become Rome's first emperor. The republic, at least in name, was over, and in its place stood something new, something shiny, something dangerous, an empire, all built on the blood of the man who said he didn't want to be king, but lived like one anyway. And here's the part that sticks with me. The senators thought they were killing a dictator. But what they really did was kill the only man bold enough to wear the crown without putting it on his head. because Caesar didn't need a title to hold power. He had the people, the army, the myth, and when they took his life, they made him eternal. They turned him into something even more powerful than a ruler. They turned him into a story, one that still echoes through history, one that warns us again and again about what happens when ambition meets fear, when loyalty turns to betrayal, when the line between savior and tyrant gets so thin. You don't realize you've crossed it until the knife is already in your back. And maybe that's what makes this story so timeless. It's not just about Julius Caesar, it's about us. How we choose our heroes, how we destroy them, and how even centuries later, we still haven't learned how to live without them. Chapter 8: The Knife That Shaped an Empire. I've thought a lot about Julius Caesar since I started digging into this story, and not just as a historical figure, but as a man. A human being who walked through the world with blood in his veins and fire in his eyes, who wanted more than just power. He wanted to be remembered, and well, mission accomplished. But the more I reflect on his life, the more I realize that his death wasn't really an ending. It was a transfer, a transformation. That moment on the Senate floor, that snap in time when the knives came down, it didn't silence Caesar. It amplified him. He was no longer just Julius Caesar, the military genius, or the shrewd politician, or the scandalous lover. He became a symbol, and that's what really haunts me, because symbols are harder to kill than men. The senators thought they were saving Rome by murdering him, but what they did was give birth to the very thing they feared one-man rule, not through Caesar himself, but through the system that rose in his shadow. The empire. The irony is brutal, right? They feared a king, so they made a god. They feared tyranny, so they lit the fuse that exploded their entire republic. And in the middle of it all was this man, clever, flawed, vain, magnetic, who knew exactly how to manipulate his image. How to tell the right story at the right time. How to perform even in death. It's almost like Caesar understood something long before the rest of Rome did, that history doesn't care about facts. It remembers narratives. And Caesar, he made sure his narrative was unforgettable. But let's be honest, he wasn't a hero. Not in the way we want our heroes to be. He was ruthless, opportunistic. He used war to solve debt. He used people like chess pieces. He weaponized love, loyalty, and fear. And when he couldn't get what he wanted through charm, he took it by force. He did terrible things. And yet, I still can't bring myself to hate him, because Caesar wasn't a villain either. At least not entirely. He was ambitious, dangerously so, but also human. And maybe that's why we're still talking about him 2,000 years later. Because in his story we see the best and worst of ourselves, the hunger for purpose, the fear of irrelevance, the temptation to bend the rules just once, just enough to get ahead, and once we do, the inability to stop. It's uncomfortable, right? To realize how familiar that arc is, to look at someone like Caesar and think, that would never be me, and then wonder if, given enough power, enough influence, enough momentum, maybe it could be. Maybe it already is. Because history is full of Caesars. Men and women who rise fast, burn bright, and leave destruction in their wake. Some are remembered, most are forgotten, but the pattern is eternal. And that's the echo I keep hearing. Not the sound of daggers or speeches or marching legions, but the whisper of something deeper. That power, when left unchecked, doesn't just corrupt. It consumes. It blinds people into thinking they're immortal. And it turns good intentions into cautionary tales. Julius Caesar wanted to reshape Rome. He wanted to stabilize it, glorify it, expand it. And in some ways he did. But in doing so, he also dismantled the very system that allowed it to exist. And when he died, what rose in his place wasn't peace. It was empire. An empire that would last centuries, that would rule through conquest, slavery, and brutality, that would crumble under its own weight, and still we remember him, not the senators, not the conspirators, not the republic that bled trying to stop him, Julius Caesar. So maybe the real question isn't whether he deserved to die. Maybe the real question is whether we ever stopped living in the world his death created. Because every time a leader grabs too much power, Every time a system breaks under the weight of one man's ego, every time we trade freedom for order or justice for spectacle, that's Caesar's legacy too. And maybe the lesson isn't in his downfall. Maybe it's in the silence that followed. The silence that let the next Caesar rise, and the next, and the next. Thank you for staying with me through this journey from Rome's bustling streets to the cold marble floor where Caesar's blood was spilled. This wasn't just a story about a man. It was a story about us, about ambition, fear, loyalty, and how easy it is to lose ourselves in the pursuit of something bigger. Caesar's story didn't end with his death. In many ways, it only began. Because long after the daggers were dropped and the ashes settled, the echoes of that moment are still with us in politics, in power, in every story we tell about how things fall apart. If this episode spoke to you, moved you, or made you think differently about history, I'd love for you to share it. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe for more stories where truth is stranger and far darker than fiction. Until next time, I'm your host on True Crime Echoes. Stay curious, stay sharp, and never forget some stories survive not because they were told, but because they refused to die.